Good morning, afternoon, and evening, wherever you are. This is Andrew Stratelides with the Red Pill Religion podcast. Today, we are having a semi-structured discussion between Dr. Graham Oppy and Josh Brister. The general topic will be, where does the evidence lie? A comparison and contrast of Christianity and atheism. So, Dr. Opie, since you're our guest, could you say a few words about yourself, your background, what you do, and sort of what your position is?
Okay, so I'm a philosopher based in Melbourne, Australia. I've been at Monash University for the last it's getting on for 25 years. I mainly teach philosophy of religion, but I've taught a whole range of other subjects in the philosophy department here, including logic, metaphysics, ethics, aesthetics, philosophy of science. So I have a broad range of interests in philosophy. My research for a long time was mostly on arguments about the existence of God. I wrote a book about ontological arguments. That was my first book. And then a more general book just about arguments in general. More recently, I've got interested in a different set of questions. I'm very interested in the history of atheism, and I'm also very interested in trying to work out how we should go about moderating or deciding or evaluating debates between naturalists and theists.
Interesting. So it sounds like your most recent interest is sort of, let me put it this way, about the meta question of philosophy of religion. How we need to navigate that. Would that be a fair articulation of that?
So I think that's right. I think that my own feeling was that discussion of arguments about the existence of God wasn't very productive because people didn't spend enough time thinking about the meta questions about what it's reasonable to think that arguments can do, how arguments should be properly assessed, and so on. And I've got increasingly interested in those questions as time has gone by.
Awesome.
Interesting.
So Josh has been on our channel before, and he's a team member. And me and myself and Josh have had some discussions as well. But go ahead and say a few words about yourself, Josh.
Well, my name is Josh Brister. I'm an American and an American history teacher and a world history teacher. And I love to study philosophy, and I think it's truly an honor to be here with Dr. Oppy. I think you're one of the most brilliant atheistic philosophers, in the world today, and it's a real pleasure to dialogue with you.
You're welcome. I don't know what to say to that. I mean, you exaggerate my virtues.
No, sir.
Anyway.
No, sir. I've read some of your stuff, including arguing about gods and philosophical perspectives on God, I believe is the second title, and I would like to surely like to discuss some of your works, and I want to show how I think Christianity is more plausible than atheism.
So with that, could you, Dr. Opie, please sort of give us at least a starting point for your sort of perspective on the God question, or the religion question, or naturalism question, or however you want to put it, and sort of I guess as concisely as we can in this time, sort of chat about how that ties into, I guess, the philosophy of life that you think is most compelling. I apologize that I don't mean to go off topic, but basically outline sort of your perspective on things. That's the good way to look at it.
Okay, so it's hard to give a really brief summary, so I will do my best. I think that the right way to think about, say, the choice between a particular kind of naturalism, the kind of view I defend, and a particular kind of theism, say the kind of view that Josh defends. The right way to think about this is to, the way to work out which position you should come down on. First of all, you have to kind of say in a lot of detail what the views are. So what are all the various things that my naturalism is committed to? What are all the things, and by things I mean claims, what are all the claims that make up my naturalism and Josh's theism? Then we look to see whether there's some sort of a derivation that shows that one or other of the positions is kind of internally lacking, it's logically inconsistent or probabilistically inconsistent or something like that. And assuming that neither of the theories turns out to be inconsistent, then the kind of remaining question is, okay, so which one's better? How do we work that out? Well, I take my lead from recent work in philosophy of science that says when you've got two theories and you want to compare them, the better one is the one that explains more while being committed to less. So there's a kind of trade-off between the theoretical commitments that you've got and the amount that you can explain, and the best theory is the one that does best at managing that trade-off. Some people will want to couch this in terms of decision theory, Bayesian decision theory. So it's which one of the two theories has the best posterior probability, where you start off by assigning prior probabilities to the theories and then you conditionalize on the evidence and you work out which one's better. I'm not wedded to that way of doing things. I prefer the more kind of descriptive approach that I gave before. Okay, so that's just the framework for assessment. What I think is that when you take my naturalism and you compare it with all other views, it turns out to be the one that does best in minimizing your commitments and maximizing the explanatory breadth and depth. There are two parts to that claim. One part, I think, is relatively easy to justify. The other part is long and complicated and the discussion goes on forever. The easy bit, I think, is that naturalism is a simpler view than competitors. And the reason why I say this is because basically the way that I think about naturalism, what naturalists commit themselves to, is just all the stuff that everybody agrees on. So there's a universe, and by everyone, I mean everyone suitably informed, because part of what's going to fill out the content of the view is science. But so I'm going to suppose that everyone agrees there's a universe. It's pretty big. It's been around for a long time, many billions of years. It's got a particular physical constitution and chemical constitution, at least in certain places. Living creatures and so on. There's a history. People or our ancestors appeared, depending how far back you want to trace it, but hominids many millions of years ago now. So there's a long history. What is there? The answer is that stuff and nothing else. And then other views add in more stuff, and that makes them more complicated. So what I think of as the kind of easy side of the argument is arguing that naturalism is the simplest view. On the other hand, there are explanatory questions about what can you explain, and other views suppose that the extra things that they're committed to enable them to explain more. So if you ask, where did the universe come from? Some people think, well, there was something else that created the universe. And in short, what I'm going to ask sort of in response is, okay, and what's the status of that extra thing? Right? If you think that it exists of necessity, I'm just going to say the universe exists of necessity. And as far as the ability to explain why the universe exists, there's no advantage that falls to the opposing view. And then I'm going to repeat that trick over and over and over when we ask about all the other questions where you might think that you've got some kind of explanatory advantage. Okay, so there's a very quick summary.
Sure. Josh, could you do the same and sort of summarize the framework you use and sort of your perspective on theism, sort of as a freestanding before we start sort of discussing and you guys take turns poking at each other's views?
Yeah, sure. And I do appreciate, Dr. Oppy, you saying all that. Seems consistent with what I've read, the various articles that and pieces that I've read from you. Now, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, Dr. Oppy, and I'm sure you probably are, being a distinguished philosophy professor. But Thomas Reid, in his inquiry into the human mind on the principles of common sense, there's this Scottish common sense realism that was going on in the 18th and 19th century. And as a history teacher, I like to communicate this to my students, to my kids, because it was so instrumental in influencing America's founding. Let me just read to you a quote by Thomas Reid. This is Thomas Reid, Common Sense Realism. If there are certain principles, as I think there are, which the constitution of our nature leads us to believe, and which we are under a necessity to take for granted in the common concerns for life without being able to give a reason for them, these are what we call the principles of common sense, and what is manifestly contrary to them is what we call absurd. The basic things in life we can know intuitively in a first person commonsensical perspective, like the existence of the universe and other minds, etc., etc. Now, these come with it a whole barrage of things in our mind, computations that have to be done, but which we take for granted on the basis of common sense. Now, when we take into consideration reason and what makes an argument plausible or implausible, sound or unsound, we also have to take history into account. You mentioned in your book, Arguing from Gods, on page 5 and 6, you have this huge paragraph that you argue against cumulative arguments. Now, I think Christian theism, is really based on a cumulative argument. I tend to be a classical theist that tries to argue for the existence of God, but I think there are other arguments which, if you want the simplest theory, Dr. Oppy, you're going to have to take all those things into account. For example, that we can have intentional states of consciousness, that there's a parent design, at least a parent design in the universe, that tends to show that in the anthropic coincidences of our universe. We it has a better explanatory power and scope in that it explains things in history. For example, miracles. So for those reasons and a whole lot of others, I think Christianity does give a cumulative case, and I think you have to take that into account if you're going to consider what is indeed the simplest explanation.
So I'm going to go ahead and take a moment here to attempt to concisely sort of broach both perspectives, and you guys can confirm whether or not I'm making a mistake, mostly just so that our audience at home can have the same thing sort of reinforced in different words. Dr. Oppy, it sounds like your basic position is that any type of theology or atheology needs to be weighed on its simplicity and explanatory power. And you believe that naturalism, or that if we just look at things that, as you said, everyone agrees on, like that the universe exists, that the laws of physics are consistent, and so on and so forth, you believe that this has as at least as much explanatory power as theism, but it has fewer fewer claims that it needs to defend. Well, Josh, you basically said that that there are intuitions and things that we need to explain, as well as things about the universe, like the structure of human history and things like that. And you believe that naturalism does not explain that as well as theism. Is that a reasonable summary, do you guys think?
I think so.
So I'm not sure. So let me say one thing which I didn't say before that might make a difference to your summary. So I think that what we're going to compare is two theories of everything. So you've got to imagine that you've elaborated every single proposition that you're committed to. And then we're comparing two of these fully elaborated positions. The positions will agree on lots of things, and they can be about whatever you like, right? I'm going to treat those as the data to be explained. What we agree about is data. What we disagree about is theory, right? Because we disagree about it. And amongst the data, there will be all kinds of stuff about various things that Josh mentioned. So about consciousness, about states of mind, about the alleged fine-tuning of the fundamental constants, about reports of miracles, for example. There won't be in the data anything about miracles because on my side, I don't believe there ever have been any. But what's indisputable and what's definitely there as data is going to be the reports of miracles, of which there are many in practically every human culture and so on. So I don't think that, I mean, the way that you gave the summary, it made it sound as though there might be a whole lot of claims that were just being overlooked in the way that I set this discussion up. But that's not the case. Every claim that we can formulate will be in there. Either it's going to be there as theory or it's going to be there as data.
Okay, I just very quickly, because I don't want to have us go too much on a rabbit hole. You believe that atheism, or naturalism specifically, in your specific brand of naturalism,
yeah,
explains all I'll call them the data questions of things that we can agree on, of these reports of miracles happened, or this historical report happened, and that those things are explained, but the interpretation of them might be different, right? To the theist, a certain event might be a miracle, while to the naturalist, it could be something else, right?
Well, I mean, in the case of miracle reports, part of the dispute will be about whether there was whether in fact there was an event that corresponded to the reports or not in some cases. Right? In some cases, there was a historical event like all those people that gathered at Fatima, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's no doubt there was a historical event, a gathering of people, but the reports that emerged from some of the people there about the sun sort of flying about all over the sky, that's just reports, and I'm sure didn't correspond to anything in reality. There's some quite I mean, there are lots of interesting questions There are questions about how many people made these reports at the time, how many subsequently came to believe those reports even though they were present and suppose that they must have witnessed the same things too, and so on. There's lots of kind of interesting questions about what happens when you're part of a crowd and you're asked to remember the event subsequently and so on. But yes, the leaving aside the
Well, I don't know.
sorry, yeah,
I,
I'll let you go.
I don't know if that's really, those are really good explanations of Jesus's miracles. Now you said, and I wrote down, there were many reports of miracles, and I didn't get the rest. I think you said mentioned or implied throughout history. Now that was David Hume's basic argument against miracles. New Testament research has come to a consensus that we can't simply, you know, paint with a broad brush or accept David Hume's arguments uncritically. There has been many works that have critiqued David Hume's arguments, including, and I'm sure you're aware of N.T. Wright. He's an Anglican scholar, a book called The Resurrection of the Son of God. And I just want to say how the miracle of Jesus, just taking it from a historical point of view, is different, or it's not simply analogous to other miracles in other religions. This is what he says, quote, "We have evidence for plenty of messianic or would-be messianic movements in the century or so of Jesus. They routinely ended with the violent death of the founder. When that happened, his followers faced a choice: give up the movement or find yourself a new leader. We have evidence of both. Going around saying your leader had been raised from the dead was not an option, except in the case of the followers of Jesus of Nazareth." So I do think that there's some non-analogous types of evidence for Jesus as contrasted with other so-called miracle reports. You also have New Testament research pointing or showing the historical trustworthiness of the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, et cetera, et cetera. I'm sure you've heard all of that, Dr. Oppy, but I think when we look at the data, I think we can come at it with different viewpoints, and sometimes I think our skepticism is not warranted unless we're looking at it in the lens of common sense. And I think Thomas Reid gave a critique of Hume, and I think it's still alive to this day.
So I'm not sure where to start. So Hume, in his famous essay on miracles, has two very different kinds of objections. One objection is a kind of a priori, very sweeping objection, which sort of suggests that we can tell before we look that no miracle reports could be correct. That argument is not very strong. It's been criticised by lots of people, including lots of atheists. A good example would be John Ehrman in his book, Hume's Abject Failure, which is a discussion of the failure of that
I was
argument.
just about to mention that one.
But most people who read Hume these days and are interested in taking something away from his discussion don't look at the first part of the essay, they look at the second part, because in the second part, Hume makes some general points, and they are only general points, and so we'll come back to this in a sec, about how weak the evidence for any actual claim for a miracle is. And he says some very general things about where the reports come from, who makes them, how many people we can establish were independent witnesses to the miracle, and so on. And that part of what he's got to say, I'm going to agree with, though I think that you've got to fill in. There's lots of questions to fill in. So in any particular case, if someone, as happens all the time, someone reports that there's a statue and it's crying tears of milk, right? A typical sort of early 21st century miracle report. You want to look at the body of these reports. You want to look at all the similar reports that actually have been investigated and the results have turned up nil. You want to look at the people who are making the reports and think about what kind of barrow they've got to push when they're making the reports. You've got to think about the independent improbability of the report. Certainly, if you're a naturalist, the independent probability that a statue is going to cry tears of milk is pretty close to zero, and so on. Right? So when I was talking about miracles, I'm just talking about all the miracle reports of everywhere in the world across time and place. And this is one of the things that Hume says, right? It's a remarkable fact about miracle reports that pretty much everybody who accepts miracle reports and takes them to have religious significance supposes that they support their own religion. How strange that should be, that it should be that way. Well, not really. I mean, he's being sarcastic, but there's that point alone gives you, I mean, you mentioned earlier skepticism. That point alone gives you very strong reason to be skeptical about every single miracle report.
I don't think so, Dr. Oppy.
So I'm going to go ahead and interrupt for a moment here. If both you gentlemen could take a few minutes to just sort of describe what you mean by miracle report in simple language, just to make sure we're not in a semantic muddle and that we're talking about the same thing. I think that would be very helpful.
Let me go first. And
Sure.
I wanted to bring up a few things, in response, because I think you said many different things. I think there's a lot of things that could be said, but I think a miracle could be defined as an act of God that the effect would not come about by natural processes on its own. During the 18th century, various Christian apologists and Christian thinkers, they even replied to Hume. They even brought up Napoleon Bonaparte and the uniqueness of Napoleon Bonaparte at the Battle of Waterloo. As a history teacher, this is very important to me because historical events are not the same as repeatable events, as things you would expect to be repeatable. So they're particular instances, and I think to determine if one of them is historical, we have to look at the particular evidence, Dr. Oppy, and not simply the general background evidence that miracles don't indeed happen in general. It seems to me that instead of looking at the evidence with an open mind, you're simply weighing the evidence against any particular historical event, and that's a bad in my opinion, as a history teacher. Now I know I'm not a professor, but I don't think that's how historians work in the field.
And again, it's sort of a two-parter. First, sort of defining what you mean by miracle report, and then go ahead and feel free to respond to Josh.
So, in the context of the Christian religion, and perhaps in the context of monotheistic religions more generally, miracle reports are going to be reports of events, particular events, that it's supposed by people who are accepting the reports are evidence of the kind of direct handiwork of the God. We want to distinguish the miracles from other features of the world that are also supposed to be evidence of the handiwork of God. So perhaps, for example, you look at the sky, you look at the night sky, and you're just sort of impressed by the grandeur of the heavens, and you think all of this is the work of God or something like that. That's not going to be a miracle, right? So there's something else to miracles other than there being the direct intervention of God. And that bit has to do with what you'd expect in the regular course of events were it not for the particular intervention of the deity. So something like that is what a miracle is in the Christian religion, but there are miracles, there are reports of miracles in other religions where other things stand in for God. So it might be the direct work of many gods rather than one, or it might be the direct work of something that's lesser than a god but still clearly supernatural. So that, for example, in Eastern religions, you can have devas or all kinds of things that can work miracles.
Well,
Right, and so that would be the more general account of a miracle that I'm working with.
Sure. So just to summarize what I think the point of agreement is, that a miracle is an activity or something that occurs in the world that is not modeled by our normal everyday to-day expectation. And for the theist, the explanation is the action of God or gods. Is that the point of agreement that I'm hearing, or is there something I'm missing?
So it seems to me that's pretty close. And this has nothing to do with the improbabilities of the antecedent improbabilities of the events. And you have to understand normal day-to-day in the right sense. So suppose there's a big lottery with 1 trillion tickets and I happen to win. That's extraordinarily unlikely, but if there's a lottery, someone's going to win. Improbable things happen all the time. This is not a point about probabilities.
Yeah, but surely you're not considering the specific probability for the particular historical events in question. Now, this is what I was saying, that the various apologist thinkers such as Les and William Paley argued against Hume in the 18th and 19th century. Excuse me, that they said if an improbable event with a theological understanding of that event happens over and over, and especially at of Jesus saying, "Let them be healed," or "You may walk," or something like that, then the improbability that it's a natural occurrence goes lower and lower each time, and especially over multiple occurrences. It seems to me, Dr. Oppy, and it seems that you're painting with a broad brush in trying to isolate these particular things in your overall philosophical understanding that miracles don't in fact occur. But if you step back like Thomas Reid and the common sense realist, I think you have to explain all of this. And this goes back, the reason why I brought this up, it goes back to what you said against the cumulative argument um, in your book, Arguing About Gods. It just seems to me the totality of the evidence points to these miracles being authentic and not merely one-off things or isolated things in history.
Okay, maybe I should say something about cumulative arguments at this point, because obviously the way that I set up the discussion about how to evaluate naturalism and theism is a kind of cumulative case. You consider everything and you weigh all of the considerations. What I was talking about back in it's a long time ago now, when I was writing, arguing about gods, was what you do when you've got a whole lot of separate arguments, where an argument's a set of premises and a conclusion, and you've got a bunch of arguments, all of which have the same conclusion, but they have very different premises. And maybe there's some way of constructing a really big argument that uses all of those little arguments, but it's not obvious how that's going to go, because once you've got a set of propositions that's sufficient to entail a conclusion, you can add in as many more propositions as you like, and it won't affect the fact that the conclusion follows from the premises.
Why can't
There's something a bit odd about the idea of a cumulative case where we're talking about logically valid or allegedly logically valid arguments?
I don't think so, and here's why. When we walk or do anything in our everyday lives, we're interpreting things through our senses. Now, those things that are interpreted through our senses are hitting our retina between, I believe it's 300 to 600 million millimicrons, and it's not the only way we can interpret things. So, what I'm trying to say is that by sense detection and perceptual constancy and pattern recognition and decision theory, which you brought up, I think there's a plethora, excuse me, pardon me, of things where we make these intuitive deductions of the external world. We're not simply isolating them. So I don't think you can isolate these particular miracles from these other religions just because they have reports and so forth. Why not look at the overall historical case for theism and Christian theism in particular?
So I sense another possible muddle here, and I'm just going to summarize real quick to make sure that we're on the same page. It sounds like you, Dr. Oppy, were talking about that you can't make a cumulative deductive argument, basically, right? That if the ontological argument, for example, is either sound or not sound, and having a bunch of valid arguments doesn't add or subtract to the soundness of them, and that's sort of that's the type of cumulative argument you were criticizing, and that something like a historical inductive argument or an inductive argument based on experience or reports or different data is a different type of argument that might be cumulative in nature. And I think there might have been a bit of a confusion on that distinction.
Right, so that's right. I mean, when I wrote Arguing About Gods, I was well aware of Swinburne's cumulative argument, which is a kind of inductive, as you say, a kind of inductive argument, or you might prefer to think of these as a sort of extended argument by inference to the best explanation, which is closer to how I'm thinking about it. And of course, in that sense, there can be cumulative arguments because that's just another kind of argument.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I like to picture it like this way, Dr. Oppy, and pardon me, this isn't my own analogy. I get it from one of your colleagues or peers in the field, Dr. William Lane Craig. He pictures these arguments as like a medieval knight's chainmail, the protection that a medieval knight would wear, that they're all linked together in a certain way, and it's a person cannot, or a naturalist for instance, cannot just pick off one of the links in the chain because they're held together by a plethora of other links. Now, I wanted to bring up one other thing, Dr. Oppy. In your book, well, in that same book, Arguing Against Gods, on 173, on page 173, you go over the Coulomb cosmological argument, and you say, in view of the bewildering variety of complex issues raised by the cosmological argument, that therefore the three premises of the Coulomb cosmological argument cannot be sound. Now, I think that's a really, and I'm saying this with all humility, I think that's a really bad, a bad way to dismiss the Coulomb cosmological argument. I think it is persuasive because it doesn't seek to prove too much. And William Lane Craig would concur with this. All of the premises of the Coulomb are more plausible than their negation. Do you think it might be possible, because of naturalistic commitments, do you think it might be possible that that's why you think it's just bewildering to accept the conclusion of the Coulomb cosmological argument?
So I'm looking at page 173 and I can't find the word bewildering in it. Sorry.
I'm sorry. I apologize. That this is an article written by William Lane Craig. It's in the Blackwell's Companion of Natural Theology. The bewildering was not your own word, and I got that a little wrong. It's you dismiss that argument, though, and that's what Craig says about what you said.
So I don't think I dismiss it. And before that, we need to work out what we mean by it here. So there's, if you go by, so there's a recent 2-volume collection on called The Coulomb Cosmological Argument, edited by Paul Capan and William Lane Craig. And in it, they take the Coulomb argument to be not just the Coulomb syllogism, everything that begins to exist has a cause of its beginning to exist. The universe began to exist, so the universe has a cause of its beginning to exist. Not just that, but a whole lot of subsidiary arguments for the premises and for the claim that from the conclusion you can get to the existence of God. And they take all of that to fall under the scope of the label, the Coulomb cosmological argument. So it's important that I know what you're asking me about, whether you're just asking me about the syllogism or whether you're asking me about the whole family
I think I'm asking
arguments.
you just about the, I'm thinking the context is just about the syllogism, because he talks about Hazali, Craig does, Hazali, and it said, and he says that that your view is that you find the premises bewildering.
Well, that's not, I would never have said that. That's not my word.
All right.
So,
All right.
So we're about a quarter to the top of the hour, and now is sort of a good time for us to tie a bow on any threads of conversation and sort of come up with
Actually, Andrew, Dr. Oppy, would it be okay if we extended it maybe 20 more minutes past?
That should be okay. We can keep going a little bit longer. Yeah.
Okay. I appreciate that. And I thank you so much for this opportunity. Sorry for if I misquoted you. I'm a big fan of yours. I do have a direct quote from you in your philosophical perspectives on infinity on page 272.
Yep.
No, it's on page 48. It's on page 48.
Yeah.
Okay. This is what you say, Dr. Oppy. You say this is regard to the argument. You say to embrace the conclusion of one's opponent's reductio ad absurdum arguments, and this allegedly absurd situation are just what one ought to expect if it were there. Physical infinities. Now, this is talking about David Hilbert's hotel, and
Yeah.
when you're talking about infinities existing in reality, then you're simply, this is what I find funny. And as a non-philosopher, I'm doing my best, but if you're going to apply infinities, actual infinities to reality, you're going to get all sorts of absurdities. So it would seem to me that the man who takes a commonsensical approach to these things should not be an atheist or a naturalist, if that's the the windfalls or what the approach that they have to take. What say you, Dr. Oppy?
So in this context, the question about whether there's any respect in which natural reality is actually infinite. There's my actual position is a kind of agnostic position. I don't think that we've got sufficient reason to make a judgment one way or the other. However, if you were committed to the view that the actual world is infinite in certain respects, you might still perfectly well think that something like Hilbert's hotel was impossible. And my considered view about, for example, Hilbert's hotel is just that it is impossible, outright impossible. However, sorry, no, I'll stop there.
And I apologize. I'm ignorant of this, and so I'm sure at least some of our audience is as well. What is Hilbert's hotel?
Okay, so the German mathematician David Hilbert pointed out that imagine an infinite plane that's got a hotel on it, and the hotel's got infinitely many rooms, and we'll imagine just that the rooms are sort of one by one heading off into the distance. So there's room 1 and then room 2 and room 3. And for every natural number far enough away, there's a room that's got that number on the door. So it's a hotel with an infinite number of rooms. Then suppose the hotel's full and somebody turns up and says, can I have a room for the night? You say, fine, I can accommodate you. So you go to the person in room 1 and you move them to room 2 and you put your new arrival in room 1. You take the person from room 2 and put them into room 3. The one from room 3 you put into room 4, and so on. So even though the hotel was full, you can accommodate an extra person. What's being taken advantage of here is the idea that if you've got what Cantor called accountable infinity, then you can establish a one-to-one correlation between the infinite collection and some proper part of it. So there are just as many even numbers as there are numbers. So for example, you could, if infinitely more people arrived, you could just move the person in room 1 to room 2, the one in room 2 to room 4, 1 and 3 to 6, and so on, and just accommodate or you move all the, locate all the people that you've got already, move the ones that are in odd, so that you can fit in infinitely many more people. And so it seems like here was this hotel that was full, infinitely many more people arrived, and you can still fit them in. And there are other things that might seem strange too. So if I can take away infinitely many people and rearrange them and the hotel will still be full. I can, and so on. And people like Craig say, well, all of this is absurd. It shows that there couldn't be an actual infinity. Whereas I think at most it would show that there couldn't be a hotel that had infinitely many rooms and that you could move infinitely many people around in this kind of way and so on. But since the usual point of interest here is whether the past could be infinite, it simply doesn't speak to that at all, because you can't manipulate past times in the way that you can manipulate people moving in and out of rooms. And so
okay. So basically it comes down to trying to determine whether a countable infinity is analogous to an infinite history of the universe.
Yeah.
And whether that can be instantiated and made actual.
That's one of the sub-arguments for the Coulomb cosmological argument, and that's why I think this is very pertinent. And you make that case on page 53, Dr. Oppy. This is what you say. I'll read your quote, your exact words. There can, after all, be a hotel in which infinitely many new guests are accommodated, even though all the rooms are full, via the simple expedient of moving the guests in room N to room 2N for all N. Now, here's what I don't understand. If you apply that to reality, like you said, Craig does, and that's who I'm largely dependent on here. It just seems if you're gonna hold to that instead of accepting the logical conclusion that the universe began to exist, I just feel that you're accepting it for naturalistic commitments, and I don't think that's the simplest explanation.
So, I think I'd like to, since you quoted from me, the way that you made that quote, it sounds like I was just contradicting myself before when I said that my considered view is that there can't be such a hotel. What I'm doing at that point is saying, look, there's a dilemma here for people who think that there can't be physical infinities, because I mean I give an account of how you might try to build such a hotel and say, if you could do it, then, well, that would just be it. You would have this infinite totality, right? On the other hand, if you can't, then you haven't managed to show that just because you can't build the hotel, that there can't be any other kinds of actually instantiated infinities. And the whole point of this argument was that it was in aid of, as you say, a premise in support of the idea that the universe began to exist, or sorry, natural reality began to exist, because if the past's infinite, then it didn't begin to exist. There's no point at which it began, right? So
yeah,
I didn't say there can, after all, be a hotel, blah, 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 blah. As I said before, my considered view is, and has been for a very long time, that there can't be such a hotel. The point I'm trying to make is that it's irrelevant to the question whether the past can be infinite one way or the other.
Well,
with
surely
respect to the
not.
hotel.
Surely that's not irrelevant. I mean, we can measure time, and analogously, we can, by an argument, look at David or Hilbert's hotel, and we can, by analogy, measure time. I don't see how that's not relevant here.
Again, just to make sure we're not in a semantic muddle, it seems like, Josh, your view is that if naturalism is true, that sort of implies that we can probably analogously reason about space and time. That space and time are sort of the same thing in their quantifiable or finite or infinite nature. And Dr. Oppy, you're saying that you don't think that we can make that analogy, or rather, I apologize, I was getting a phone call, that there's a possible disconnect there, right? So that the things we know about physical and material infinities or finitude doesn't necessarily apply to time.
Do you want me to say something in response to that? So very quickly, I think that it's an open question whether the universe is spatially infinite. What we do know is something about sort of a lower bound on how big it is. But I don't think that it's an open question whether the universe contains any infinite hotels, right? So it's not just that some sort of analogy between space and time, or some disanalogy between space and time here.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think you're arguing that even though no hotels like Hilbert's hotels can exist in reality, the very fact that we can make a theoretical possibility of it undercuts the second premise of the Coulomb cosmological argument when it uses the impossibility of an actual infinite existing in reality. I just think even though it's possible, it's not probable. That it seems to me that we have to look at the dictates of common sense and not pure reason. For example, it seems that you're trying to divide or differentiate pure reason from the common world of common sense.
Okay, so I think that accusation's probably not quite right either, though when I say what I'm about to say, you might think of reasons to disagree. But the common sense view up until at least up until Aquinas and probably later, was that the only way that you could know that the past wasn't infinite was divine revelation. And the kind of common sense view that was arrived at in very many cultures and relied upon was that the past was infinite. Right? That was the common sense view. So it's a bit hard to say that there's some intuition or some common sense that people generally have that counts against that view. It's true that in the West, with the dominance of Christianity, lots and lots of people have been brought up in more recent times, like in the last some hundreds of years, to find it natural to suppose that the past's finite. And as it turns out, with 20th century physics, we now all have evidence of various kinds which suggests that at least our universe has a finite history, though whether that means that natural reality has a finite history is another question. Right?
Yeah.
So it's a difficult point. What's kind of the common sense thing to believe here?
When I
What's happened?
Sorry, I made a mistake. My finger slipped and poor Josh got muted. Josh, please unmute yourself.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Are you asking me? I can hear you, yes.
Okay. I think what I was saying is when I'm usually, and I'm one of the Christian debaters, and I think it's really important that, that we express our ideas, and I love this exchange. But when I argue with atheists or naturalists, they always, it seems to me, give an argument. For example, the problem of evil. A sophisticated argument that has a long history itself is, I know that you know that and probably teach on that. But it seems to me that even though it's possible that it shows something. It doesn't mean it's probable. Just as I think infinity, and when we, go backward and apply Hilbert's hotel to reality. I want to bring up common sense realism again. This is a quote again. This is my favorite philosopher, Thomas Reid. And I really do think he confronts naturalism. This is what he says. We see then that Mr. Hughes' philosophy is very much like a hobby horse, which a man, when he is ill, can keep at home with him and ride to his contentment. But just in case he should bring it to the marketplace, his friends would quickly impanel a jury to confiscate his estates and have the solicitude never to leave him alone again. I think even though we can be skeptical of these commonsensical notions, I don't think they're at all plausible or explain the totality of Christian theism. And I go back to my, that chainmail on a night again. I don't see any reason why a person today should be a naturalist or an atheist. What would you like to respond to that, Dr. Oppy?
So, I mean, the thing you read from Reid is a nice piece of abuse. It's quite good. I was going to say something about the chainmail analogy, though this opens up a whole other very large topic. There's a question about what an argument can do, right? So suppose that you've got a valid argument. So there's a bunch of premises and a conclusion, and the conclusion follows logically from the premises. Doesn't matter what it is. It can be an ontological argument, cosmological argument, argument from evil. It doesn't matter what it is.
Yes.
There's a question about what that argument can do in a situation where we've got people who disagree with one another about the claim that's the conclusion of the argument. So we've got one person who thinks that God exists, one person who thinks that God doesn't exist. Let's suppose that they're well-informed, intelligent, sensitive, thoughtful, reflective, and so on. What if I put forward an argument? So let's suppose I'm a theist and I put forward to an atheist an argument that has as its conclusion God exists and has a bunch of premises. What can I hope to be doing with that argument? Right. Now, you might think the answer to that is obvious. I'm trying to persuade the atheist to accept the conclusion. Under what conditions will the atheist have a reason to accept the conclusion on the basis of the argument that I've given to him or her? Well, the kind of starting point is it better be that they accept all of the premises.
Well,
if there's even one of the premises that they don't accept, then the arguments, they'll just say, I don't believe that premise. And rationally, that's a sensible thing to do, right? And so at that point, the argument achieves nothing.
But you're basing it on agreement, right? I'm basing like Thomas Reid, the comments would base it on the ordinary affairs of life. For example, David Hume on causation. David Hume wasn't skeptical of causation. In his letters and so forth, in his private life, he very much affirms, causation or intentionality. He just doesn't think we can, show it to be a proof. But in a person's private life and how they conduct their affairs through life, and that's why I think history, the study of history, and not just philosophy, has a strong bearing on, how we can determine if Christianity or naturalism or whatever is more plausibly true.
Okay, so two things. One is, I agree absolutely that we shouldn't be trying to answer these questions a priori, just applying philosophical principles. But it's not just history. It's archaeology, it's physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, sociology. It's the sciences in their entirety that we should be bringing to bear on the question, because we know lots of stuff about the past from what we know about the present, and that's all relevant information. So that's kind of one point. I've forgotten what the other point was. There was an important about Hume. I'm not Hume.
Yes.
I don't share his views about personal identity or causation or a whole lot of other things.
But you brought up the miracles argument.
Sure, that's right, because on that point, the second part of the miracles argument, Hume has what I consider to be a good point, though I agree with you that it has to be filled out, right? But where I disagree with you is in thinking that there's some reason to ignore all of the miracle reports and all the reports of scientifically anomalous phenomena that we get from all of the cultures all over the world all the time. Well, that's all relevant. It tells us lots of stuff about the way in which we're prone to making errors of various kinds in our reasoning that you need to take into account.
That's a good point, but that's a good point, Dr. Oppy. But I don't think you're considering that there's strong evidence for miracles going on around the world today. I'm not sure if you're aware of a scholar. His name is Craig Keener. He wrote an entire 2-volume book on miracles. I'm sure you probably are aware of it. And he documents that all throughout the world, miracles do in fact take place. It just seems to me that the skepticism of Hume lies behind a lot of these arguments. And Thomas Reid, his own contemporary, Thomas Reid, who Hume read, I think Reid in his common sense realism really devastates the unmitigated skepticism of David Hume when it comes to lived life.
So I would have thought that common sense realism would be on the side of there aren't any miracles, right? That's just the kind of common sense position. People have amputations, their legs don't grow back, despite the fact that you can find testimony in the churches to the regrowth of amputated limbs.
Well, that's not what Thomas Reid would say. It's probably the chief proponent of that school of common sense realism. That's not what he would say.
Sure, but he was
back. Yeah.
Go on.
I was just going to say he would take a step back and say, look at all of history and not just try to look at one sphere of reality where miracles don't happen. You know, I think when we look at something, especially history, there's so many interpretations, and we have to use our selection process and things like that to interpret reality. And I don't understand why you won't do that when it comes to history that shows the miracles of Christianity, especially in the New Testament, different from other miracles.
Well, I've read a reasonable amount on this topic, but I've also read quite a lot about the miracles of Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, Judaism, although you might count those as amongst the miracles of Christianity, depending upon how you're counting these things, and lots of other religions as well. And I can just see the commonalities in the circumstances in which the reports are offered, features of the reports, the apparent reliability of the testimony, the questions about the testimonial chains, the absence of any clear cases of independent confirmation from multiple reliable sources, and so on.
So we're about 5 minutes from our agreed stop time, and
it's been a fun discussion.
Yeah, it's been a fantastic discussion, and I just wanted to give you both a chance to sort of sum up the discussion and try to tie a knot on your next sort of round, and
Okay.
so that we can end on sort of a nice conclusion.
Yeah. And
Uh,
before we do that, I just want to say what a fan I am of yours, Dr. Oppy. I know I've said that again, but I just want to say that again. I look really look up to you. You're a distinguished scholar, and I do hope we can have you back, or you participate in more of these discussions. I think it shows how, there's a lot of vitriol between our communities sometimes, and you're a stand-up person, and I too want to find ways where we can work together and build, work together and build things for our future.
okay, do you want to quickly sum up?
Yeah, let's do that.
Well, let me go last since Dr. Opie went first.
Okay, well, I don't really have anything in particular that I wanted to say in conclusion. I think that I'm just trying to reflect on the discussion, which is a bit hard without sort of sitting down and listening to the tape. That one of the things that comes out in discussions like this usually is that there'll be lots of significant things that we agree about, and then there'll be lots of significant things that we disagree about. This is a very common fact of life for philosophers, because philosophy, so much of it is, if you pick two philosophers, they'll find endless things to disagree about. But when it comes to questions about religion, if you pick people from two different religions, or you pick people, one of whom belongs to a religion and the other one who has no religion, there'll be lots and lots of things that they disagree about, and it's quite hard um, to aim for much more than trying to work out, okay, so what exactly are the things that we disagree about, and what are the kind of important things that we disagree about? And you can, I think, probably, I would think, if I sat down and listened to the tape, that I'd think that that was sort of what emerged from the discussion that we've had.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Josh, do you want to sum up your part, and then I'll sort of sum up my thoughts as an observer?
Yes. I want to sum up. Well, I've showed you a lot of praise, Dr. Oppy, and it's sincere. Absolutely sincere. I want to, you're my favorite atheistic philosopher. But I want to quote one more time from my favorite Christian theistic philosopher, Thomas Reid. Conjectures and theories are the creatures of men and will always be found unlike the creatures of God. If we would know the works of God, we must consult themselves with attention and humility, without daring to add anything of ours to what they declare. A just interpretation of nature is the only sound and orthodox philosophy. Whatever we add of our own is apocryphal and of no authority. It seems to me at the end of the day, instead of mere philosophizing, we have to have humility enough to take into a broader account of reality, um, uh, and be mindful. And I hate to, I hope this doesn't come across as ill-tempered or passive aggressive in any way, but be mindful that we don't paint history or miracles with a broad brush and say they're equally uncredible. I think when you look at the miracles of Jesus, for example, it does happen in a certain context. And I wouldn't dare argue that all of the miracles in the Bible are of the same weight. And I think most Christians would do this. They would look at the particular miracles associated with the resurrection of Jesus, and try to argue that it's more plausible on theistic grounds than on naturalistic grounds. All of these arguments from natural theology, I think a common sense interpretation of them does lead, if one has modesty and humility, does lead that they are successful. But other than that, I think faith is a commitment, and what will you do? And it's been Christianity that has moved mountains, not atheism. Most people in life have not been atheists. I think all these arguments are the best argument that can be given.
So just as sort of an observer, I notice, especially in this conversation, it seems like some of the tools and thinking tools that both Dr. Oppy and Josh used are very similar. And I suspect one of the things that's different between you two is what tool you use in what context, and what the process for deciding what tool to use in what context for the analysis is, which again is a very deep conversation, and hopefully one that we can touch on in the future. With that, I think this ends our discussion, and good fortune to everyone, and God bless.